This is Chapter 5 Loops, Programming Exercise 17, Display a Pyramid. So we're going to write a program that prompts the user to enter an integer from 2 to 15 and display a pyramid. So what do they mean by displaying a pyramid? Well, we're going to display a number pyramid, and when we ask the user to enter a number between 2 to 15, depending on the user's input, between the number 2 and 15 will shape how the pyramid looks. So let's say we enter 7, we're going to get a pyramid that looks like this right here. From number 1 to 7, there will be 7 rows, and let's see, 7, 6, 13 columns. So each number that you enter will display a different pyramid. So if you enter 1, it will just display the 1 here. 2 will display numbers from 1 to 2, like so, right? And then 3, 4 will go all the way here, 5, 6, 7, all the way to 15, which gets pretty large, right? The pyramid gets pretty large. So how we're going to do this is by using nested loops. In this case, what we're going to be using is nested for loops for our exercise. And what is a nested loop? Well, a nested loop is a loop within a loop, an inner loop within the body of an outer loop. So basically, if you take a look at this while loop and this for loop, right, two separate loops. The outer loop is the loop that is outside of all other loops. So that'll be the outer loop. And an inner loop will be a loop within a loop. So this for loop is an inner loop of the while loop. The while loop is an outer loop of the for loop. So you can have multiple loops within a loop. So there could be another for loop up here, or another while loop, or another while loop down. All right, so you can have multiple inner loops, and those inner loops are considered nested loops. So how this works is that the first pass of the outer loop triggers the inner loop. So in this while loop, there's a counter. So each time it counts once and it goes into the inner loop, and the inner loop says, hey, for I equals 0, as long as I is less than 25, do something inside its inner loop. So it runs from 0 to 24. So basically it runs 25 times before this for loop finish. It jumps out and goes back to its while loop, and it increments the count again by 1, and then repeats this inner loop over and over and over many times until this outer loop, this while loop, finish this returns a false for this while loop. Right, so then the second pass of the outer loop triggers the inner loop again, right, over and over. This repeats until the outer loop finishes. So once this while loop finishes from the doing its loop, it will no longer run the inner loop, and it's done, and it will go out of this curly braces and continue whether the code is next. So of course, a break within either the inner or outer loop will interrupt this process. So a break is the only way, one way, actually not the only way, but one way to escape a loop. So while you do some work up here before you enter the for loop down here, you could encounter some kind of condition that you satisfy, and you enter the keyword break, and it'll break out of this while loop and not run it anymore. So anyway, let's continue. Let's figure out how we're going to design our loop, right? So here is the pyramid that we have to create. Now, the thing is, we're not going to just create this pyramid just like this. If you will have to break it down and try to see what goes into this pyramid and how to construct it. So an easy way to do this, right, is to actually design this pyramid into 3 different triangles, 3 different structures. There's a triangle that I'm going to create here. So that will be our triangle 1. And then we're going to try to display this, our triangle 2, and then this right here, our triangle 3. Now all of this might be very confusing. So what we're going to try to do is try to code it, and I'll show you what I mean. So, and here's of course another perspective. Right here, you might see, hey, there's no triangle here. Well, there actually is. There is a whole bunch of white space that you don't see. And that's of course replaced by this 0 here. This 0 represents that white space here. And these other triangles, you could kind of see it right here with this 1 right here and this 2. All right. So let's try to write that out and get a better visual on how all of that works. Alright, so first thing first, as always, we're going to ask the user to enter a number between 2 to 15, and we're just going to do a simple check. Let's say if number is greater than or equal to 2 and number is less than or equal to 15, then we're going to do that for loop. Alright, then we're going to build that triangle. Else, we'll just simply say system.out.print number is not between 2 to 15 cannot build triangle. Alright, so let's say a number is too large and the triangle gets too big. We don't want to do that. If the number is between 0 and 1, well, 0 and 1, you're just going to display the number itself, right? 0 or the 1. So that's not really a triangle. So we're going to just ignore that. And of course, any negative numbers, and that's going to cause a whole other issue with displaying a triangle. But of course, you could always turn that negative into a positive and display it like that. But we're not going to go into that for now. Now we're just going to try to do our triangle. Now the first thing we want to do is after the user enter the number, right, we're going to try to display that triangle according to the number they enter. So what we're going to use for to build that triangle is a for loop. And for the first for loop is going to determine how many rows there are in this triangle. Now we will take a look back at this example from up here, right? We were to enter 7, then we expect 7 rows. So there's 1 row, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 rows. So the first for loop that I have here will determine the number of rows. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at row 1 and I'm going to make sure it runs number of times, right? Which is the input. So as long as row is less than or equal to number, row plus plus. So for each row, I'm going to work on something. Each row, I'm going to try to display or work on a triangle. So, or part of this triangle to be able to display the full pyramid. Now, the first thing I'm going to try to tackle is this triangle here. Now, of course, there's a way to display the entire thing row by row by row, but I want to be able to use a nested loop to do it, and I want to make it more simplified and easy to visualize, and that's why I broke it down to 3 triangles. So hopefully that makes sense on why I did this. Right? I want to break down into 3 triangles so I could show you how a nested loop works and a more simplified version on how we could tackle this exercise. All right, so first triangle, I have my outer for loop here, and then I want to create an inner for loop. So inner for loop is just a for loop within another loop. So for loop right here is an inner for loop of this outer for loop. Now this for loop right here is going to be our white space. What I mean by white space, well, I'll show you. Now here's the tricky part. How am I going to know how many white space or what to print, right? I have to print X amount per line every time. So I know that if I enter 7, there are actually 7 columns right here, right? 7 columns. Well, actually, that's 7 columns for triangle 2, but there's actually 6 columns for the first triangle. So for each row, I have to print 7 minus 1 or x minus 1 amount of numbers. So simply, I could just do something like this. So white space could simply be number minus row. Oops, did I white space C minus row casted to byte. So now number starts off at whatever the user enter. Let's say 7. Row starts off at 1. So each time it goes on to the next row, I want the row will increase, right? If at row 1, right, first row, it will be number minus 1, which is fine because number minus 1, 7 minus 1 is 6. And that's 6 numbers that I want to display for, or if you want to visualize as columns, I want to take up 6 columns of space. All right, so number minus row, as long as white space should be, right, if it's greater than 0, right, because we want a max amount, then white space minus minus. All right, so normally when I print this out, I would want a white space, right? White space simply space, or that's known as white space in Java. It's just a space. But in this case, I want to give you a visual. But before I do that, let me just run that, make sure everything works. All right, so let's go with a small number like 5. Let me get something like 5 right here. Now, the only issue right here that before I continue, that I just noticed is that I want to print a new line each time I run this. So the whole point of this for loop is to print a new line for every time I run this for loop. That way, every new row will have will print out something different. Now, I highlight this. You can't see it, which is fine. You can't see the white space, but let me put the underscore here, and we'll get a better visual. Oops, put the slash. That's why I get input mismatch exception, and that's input mismatch exception is because my number here expects a byte to be stored, and this character is not a byte. It's a char. All right, there we go. So voila, we have x minus 1, so 5 minus 1, take up 5 minus 1 of space, and bam. Now you might think, hey, there's nothing here, which is fine. So let's just get a visual again. As you can see, all the way at the last, the tip is taken over by triangle 2. So basically we have triangle 1 right now, which is what we just displayed. And to get a better understanding, right, let's go over that again. So this is pretty confusing when you first start, right? If this is the first time you're learning about nested loop, it may be a little bit confusing. So ignore this if. Simply this if is just to say, hey, whatever the user enter, if the user doesn't enter a number that is between 2 and 15, then don't build the triangle, right? Don't build the triangle. So after I enter the for loop, enter this if statement and it's true, then I go in. This first for loop is just to let my inner for loop do the work on each row. So for the first row, I want this to show, right? I want it to create X amount of white space. So it will be number minus row amount of white space. Then I go into the new line. New line, after I print out the new line, check what row I'm on, go on to the next row, print X amount of line for that row, and keep going until I reach a certain criteria where I don't need to print any more lines, and I'm also done with the outer for loop. All right, so I have my first triangle down. So basically first triangle, or if you want, this is also another visualization I created. Well, instead of putting underscore, I put zeros for my first triangle. Second triangle is what I'm going to tackle my next for loop. Okay, so next for loop. So this is a little more difficult. How am I going to display this? So I want to be able to print 1. Then I want to be able to print 2 space 1. New line 3 space 2 space 1. New line 4 3 2 1, so on and so forth, all the way until I reach 7. So 7 all the way to 1. So that gets a little tricky. Now the first thing I know is I want to print the larger number first, right? The max number. And to do that, well, the max number, which is the max size for that row, and that's pretty simple, right? So let's actually, before I do say anything else, let's call this for loop, whatever I'm designing now, triangle 1, or actually let's just call it triangle 2 because of what I wrote here, so you have a better visualization. I'm trying to use another for loop to design triangle 2. And triangle 2, the number it's going to start at will be the row. So if it's on row 1, then it'll equal row 1 and it'll start displaying the number from row 1. So when it's on row 2, it'll start with the number at row 2. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. And I want it to stop once it's greater than 0. And then row minus minus. All right. And of course, system.out.print, no, not print line, print triangle 2, and just do that. And let me get rid of the underscore and just put white space. All right, so this looks good, but let me just run it and let me just make sure it is coming out. All right, so bam. Now we see an issue. Let's stop that and let's verify what we did wrong here. So we have triangle 2 equals the row. The row will start at 1, and that's why it keeps displaying 1. But here's the thing, as long as row is greater than 0, well, yes, row is greater than 0, row minus minus. So now row should be, okay, there's something wrong with this logic, but let me try to understand why. Greater than, as long as greater than 0, row minus minus, and then print out triangle 2. Let's see. I mean, it logically seems correct, but let me try to talk through this and see where I made my mistake. All right, so I display this for loop, and then it's good. So after it's finished, it goes into this for loop, and I say, hey, triangle 2 equals row. Row should start off as 1, and as what am I thinking? Of course. Man, I can't believe I didn't see that. Okay. I meant to say as long as triangle 2 is greater than 0, triangle 2 minus minus. Man, that was bad. Okay. That was a logical error. Hard for me to sometimes talk, code, and think. Here we go. Okay. All right. So as you can see before, it displayed the underscore, right? So I changed that to white space. And so it displayed the white space first in the first for loop, and then the second for loop, it displayed the triangle. Now, for the first time it runs, for the first row, it says, hey, on the first row, I want you to just display a whole bunch of white space. And then for the next for loop, I just want you to display the number, as long as it's greater than 0, display it, and then stop. So it displayed this line, and then it prints a new line. So it starts at a new line and it goes back to this for loop up here and say, okay, it's time for the next row, row 2. Row 2, print this out. Row 3, print this, this, and this. All right, and let's make it look a little nicer by putting a little bit of space in between, and run that again. Let's make it smaller, and so we have we just increased the white space, so it's double that amount. And the white space in between after I display the number and a white space. All right, bam. So we have our second triangle done. we display this triangle has been displayed, and now for our third triangle. Now, our third triangle is pretty tricky, right? Third triangle starts at row 2. It doesn't start at row 1, even though I made a little mistake, a little too high, but it actually starts at row 2. It doesn't need to display anything on row 1. The only thing I have to display on row 1 is triangle 2, which display the first number 1. So I have to find out how to start at row 2 without this 2 appearing on top, and starting at number 2 and ending at 7 all the way to the bottom. So let's tackle that in our next for loop. So for loop, and this will be our triangle 3, right? And that's just from this image right here, our triangle 3. And of course, if you want, this is basically triangle 1, which I basically call it's invisible, right? Our invisible triangle right here. Now triangle 3, where should I start? Well, in this case, I know that I will always need to start at 2 for triangle 3. It will never need to start at 1. So the base number that I start off will be 2. And I will never create any number that will be, well, where will it go up to? That's the part that I have to think about, right? It will display 2, then I want to display 3, then 4. Well, that shouldn't be too hard. What I could do is compare it to the row. Now, when I'm on row 2, it just stops at the number 2. When I'm at row 3, right, 1, 2, 3, it stops at number 3. Same with the next row, it stops at row 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, it stops at 4. Bam! Now that I know that, solving this makes it so much easier. So I just say as long as it's less than or equal to row, triangle 3 plus plus. And let me make sure, right? I don't want to make the same logic error like I did before. And it looks good. System.out.print triangle 3, a little bit of space, and there we go. Now, how do I know it won't print this 2 on the first row? Well, let's see. I actually have to make sure of that. And I actually can't be sure until I verify my logic. Now it says it starts at 2 as long as triangle is less than or equal to row. Well, the first time it'll start at row 1. 2 will not, and if what I meant to say is the for loop starts at row 1, right? The outer for loop starts at row 1, and my triangle 3 starts at, is initialized as the number 2. 2 will never be less than or equals to 1. So I know for sure that because of this logic here, now it'll definitely start at row 2. So hopefully that makes sense for you too. And here we go. And because of that, I was able to design a pyramid using the numbers. All right. So hopefully all of that makes sense. And this could all be done in just a few lines of code. Okay. And just to go through that again, because I know I totally understand. First time you learn nested loops, it's really confusing, right? But the more you practice, the more you play around, the easier it will get. All right. So the question basically asks us to just display a pyramid by asking you to enter a number between 2 to 15. And if you enter a 7, this should be your output or something similar. It doesn't have to be exactly this. This is the way it's spaced out. It's just the way I prefer it, just so it'll be easier to see, visualize, or compare. All right. And to do this, one of the easiest way to do this is by using nested loops. You don't have to use nested for loops. You could just use while loops, right? But in this case, for loops is easier to design a pyramid. And to design this pyramid, you need an outer loop to decide how many rows you're going to have, and then 3 inner loops, in my case, in my example, to design these 3 triangles right here. So the first for loop will just worry about creating the white space. The second for loop worry about creating this triangle here, right? And the third for loop will create this triangle, this third triangle over here. Of course, this is just another visualization. Instead of using white space, you could use 0, and it'll look something like this. All right. And right here is the code. So basically, we have our outer for loop and our 3 inner for loop to create each of the triangle. Outer for loop, it designs the row. Inner for loop writes up the triangles on each row, or the numbers on each row. All right, so that will be it for this exercise.